In the summer of 1893, Chicago was the center of the universe. 27 million people came through its gates that year for the World's Fair. Electric lights, moving sidewalks, the world's first Ferris wheel, spinning 264 feet into the sky. Newspapers called it the White City, a shining monument to what humanity could build. 3 blocks away from all that light, there was a building with no windows on one side. A building whose owner kept changing the layout, month after month, hiring one crew of workmen, firing them before they finished, hiring another. A building the locals started calling something else. The Murder Castle. Inside those walls, soundproofed rooms with gas lines that could be controlled from a single closet. A chute that ran straight to the basement. A basement with a dissection table, vats of acid, and a kiln. The man who built it charmed everyone he met. Investors trusted him with their life savings. Women fell in love with him, sometimes 3 at a time, without any of them knowing the others existed. Police, when they finally came looking, almost walked right past him. His name was Herman Webster Mudgett. You'll know him as H. Holmes. And what happened in that building, while a million tourists walked past it every single day, may be the most disturbing true crime story in American history. Stick around, because the ending of this story isn't the part they put in the history books. It's the part that came after his death, from his own mouth, that historians are still arguing about today. Let's go back further. Before Chicago, before the castle, Herman Webster Mudgett was born in 1861 in the small town of Gilmanton, New Hampshire. On paper, nothing about his childhood explains what he'd become. His parents were strict, deeply religious. Some accounts describe a father with a violent temper. But millions of children grew up with strict, even abusive parents, and didn't grow up to become what Holmes became. There is one story, and historians debate how much of it is true, because most of what we know about Holmes's childhood comes from Holmes himself, and Holmes lied about almost everything. But the story goes like this. As a boy, he was bullied by classmates, who dragged him into a doctor's office and forced his hand onto a human skeleton, hoping to terrify him. Holmes claimed it didn't terrify him at all. He claimed it fascinated him. Whether or not that story is true, one thing is well documented. Holmes was smart. Genuinely, dangerously smart. He got into the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery, one of the best medical schools in the country, and while he was there, he ran his first con. He'd steal cadavers from the school's lab, disfigure them to make them unrecognizable, and then take out life insurance policies on fake identities, later discovering the bodies and filing claims. It's the first known scheme of a man who would spend the rest of his life turning bodies into money. He graduated in 1884, and by 1886, he'd moved to Chicago, a city growing so fast, so chaotically, that a man could reinvent himself completely, and nobody would ask too many questions. Nobody there had ever heard the name Mudgett. They only knew him as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. Holmes settled in Englewood, a neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, and took a job at a drugstore on the corner of 63rd and Wallace, owned by a woman named Dr. Elizabeth Holton. Holton's husband was dying. She needed help running the store. Holmes was charming, capable, and endlessly reassuring. Exactly what a woman in that position needed. Within months, Mr. Holton was dead. Mrs. Holton mysteriously vanished from the neighborhood shortly after. Holmes told curious neighbors she'd moved to California to live with relatives. Nobody ever heard from her again. Holmes now owned the pharmacy outright. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. In reality, he'd never actually paid Mrs. Holton for it. This was the pattern that would define the rest of his life. Charm his way into someone's trust, extract everything of value, and make the person disappear, one way or another, before they could ask for anything back. The pharmacy thrived, and directly across the street sat an empty lot. In 1887, Holmes bought it. What Holmes built on that lot would eventually take up an entire city block. 3 stories, over 100 rooms. Locals started calling it Holmes's Castle almost as soon as construction began, partly because of its size, partly because something about it just felt wrong. Here's the detail that should have raised alarms immediately, and somehow didn't. Holmes hired and fired construction crews constantly, sometimes after only a few weeks, always refusing to pay them in full, always claiming their work was unsatisfactory. Historians now believe this wasn't just Holmes being cheap. It was deliberate. He didn't want any single crew to understand the full layout of the building. Each contractor only ever saw a fragment. Only Holmes saw the whole design. And the design was staggering in its purpose. The ground floor was innocent enough, retail shops, including a relocated version of his pharmacy. But upstairs, the second and third floors became something closer to a labyrinth. Investigators who later mapped the building found hallways that led to nowhere, doors that opened onto brick walls, stairs that ended abruptly at the ceiling. A maze, purpose-built to disorient anyone unfamiliar with it, while Holmes, who carried the only complete blueprint in his head, could move through it freely. Several rooms were airtight and soundproofed, fitted with gas lines that Holmes could control remotely from a hidden panel. He could pump anesthetic or lethal gas into a room at will and watch through a peephole from an adjoining closet. One room contained a chute. It dropped straight down to the basement. And the basement was where the real purpose of the building revealed itself: a dissection table, surgical tools, vats of acid, used to dissolve flesh and prevent identification, a kiln, hot enough to reduce bone, pits of quicklime. Holmes told visitors the building was going to be a hotel, ready in time to house the massive crowds expected for the 1893 World's Fair. And that part, at least, was true. He called it the World's Fair Hotel. Here's where the story gets harder to tell, because here's where it stops being architecture and starts being people. We will likely never know the true number of Holmes's victims. Holmes himself, at different points, claimed wildly different numbers, 27 at one point, then later walking it back, then in his final confession claiming as many as 133, a number historians now believe was exaggerated for sensationalism, possibly to sell more newspapers before his execution. Investigators at the time could only conclusively confirm around 9 deaths. Modern researchers, cross-referencing missing persons reports from the era, estimate the real number is likely somewhere between 20 and 30, though we may never know for certain. What we do know is the pattern. Holmes preferred a very specific kind of victim: young women, often unmarried, often new to Chicago, often working for him as secretaries or typists, jobs he advertised constantly, always requiring applicants to take out life insurance policies naming Holmes as beneficiary, disguised as an employment requirement. Many of these women had no family nearby to notice when they disappeared. Some had traveled to Chicago specifically for the World's Fair, drawn by the very same excitement that filled the streets outside his building. That was, historians believe, exactly why he built where he did. A million strangers moving through the city constantly. Nobody would think twice about one more disappearing. One case that survives in detail is Emmeline Sigrand, a young woman Holmes hired as a stenographer. She was engaged to be married. Neighbors described her as bright, well-liked, full of plans for her future. She vanished in December of 1892. Her fiancé searched for her. He got nowhere. Holmes, when asked, calmly explained she'd moved away suddenly for personal reasons. There was Julia Connor and her young daughter Pearl. Julia had worked at Holmes's pharmacy and, by most accounts, had become his mistress after her husband left Chicago. She too vanished, along with her daughter, sometime around Christmas of 1891. Investigators later found evidence in the building's basement consistent with the dissection of an adult female skeleton. And then there was the case that would ultimately bring Holmes's entire empire down. Not one of the mysterious, forgotten women nobody came looking for. A family who absolutely, relentlessly, would not stop looking. By 1894, Holmes's schemes had gotten sloppier. He'd left Chicago, drifting between cities, running insurance fraud scams with a longtime associate named Benjamin Pitzel. The plan with Pitzel was almost identical to his medical school scheme decades earlier. Fake Pitzel's death, collect on a $10,000 life insurance policy, split the money. Except this time, Holmes didn't fake it. He killed Pitzel for real, in Philadelphia, and used a corpse disfigured enough to pass identification. He then convinced Pitzel's own trusting wife to let 3 of her 5 children travel with him: Alice, Nellie, and Howard, telling her he was reuniting them with their father, who was actually already dead. Holmes took the 3 children on a bizarre, meandering journey across the northern United States and into Canada. staying just ahead of investigators the whole way, using aliases, checking in and out of boarding houses. Along that route, he murdered all 3 children. But here's what Holmes hadn't accounted for. A Pinkerton detective named Frank Geyer. Geyer had been assigned to the insurance fraud case, and something about it nagged at him. He requested to personally track down the missing Pittsville children and spent months, Holmes's freedom, the entire time, hanging by a thread as it happened, following a paper trail of hotel registers and rented houses across multiple states. In the summer of 1895, in a rented house in Toronto, Geyer found the buried bodies of Alice and Nellie Pittsville in a cellar. Weeks later, in Indianapolis, he found what remained of Howard inside a chimney flue, along with fragments of his toys. The story broke nationally, and once newspapers had a name and a face. Holmes had already been arrested on the insurance fraud charge before the children's bodies were found. Chicago detectives went back to that strange, windowless building on 63rd Street. What they found inside, working through the maze of false walls and hidden rooms, made front-page headlines across the entire country. The soundproof chambers, the gas lines, the dissection table, the kiln. Reporters started calling it exactly what the neighbors already had: the murder castle. Holmes stood trial only for the murder of Benjamin Pittsville. Prosecutors felt it was the case with the cleanest evidence, and one conviction was all they needed. The trial captivated the country. Holmes represented part of his own defense, and by every account, was magnetic in the courtroom, calm, articulate, likable, right up until the jury returned a guilty verdict after deliberating for barely over an hour. He was sentenced to death. While awaiting execution, Holmes did something almost nobody expected. He sold his confession to a newspaper for $10,000, admitting to a staggering number of murders, claiming he could feel himself physically transforming, becoming more demonic in appearance, as though his body were reflecting what he'd done. Most historians treat this confession with real skepticism. Holmes lied constantly, even about small, verifiable things, right up until the moment of his death. Some of what he confessed to didn't match the physical evidence. Some of the people he claimed to have murdered later turned up alive. But buried in that unreliable confession were details about the castle, about specific victims, that nobody but the actual killer could have known. On May 7, 1896, Herman Webster Mudgett, H. Holmes, was hanged in Philadelphia. Witnesses said his neck didn't break cleanly. He reportedly took several minutes to die, twitching on the rope, which several newspapers seized on as a kind of grim justice. He requested his coffin be filled with cement and buried 10 feet deep, in a grave sealed further with more cement poured directly over the casket. His stated reason: to prevent grave robbers from stealing his body and dissecting it, the same fate he'd inflicted on so many others. Here's the part most retellings of this story leave out. The castle itself didn't survive much longer than Holmes did. In August of 1895, while Holmes was still awaiting trial, the building mysteriously caught fire. It was gutted, though the ground floor survived. It stood, damaged, for decades afterward, a morbid tourist attraction in its own right, until it was finally demolished in 1938. Today, a U.S. post office sits on that exact spot on 63rd Street. Nothing marks what stood there before, and the exact death toll Holmes left behind that basement, the number that started this whole video, has never actually been settled. Every retelling you'll find online will confidently give you a number: 27, 9 confirmed, 100 plus by his own confession. The honest answer is that nobody knows, and in an era before centralized missing persons databases, before background checks, before any of the systems we now take for granted, an enormous number of people, overwhelmingly young women without family nearby, could simply vanish from a booming, chaotic city, and no one would ever connect the dots. That, in a strange way, might be the most disturbing part of this entire story. Not the acid vats, or the gas chambers, or the kiln in the basement. It's that Holmes wasn't some singular, impossible monster who slipped through the cracks by sheer genius alone. He was a man who understood, correctly, that in 1893, the cracks were enormous, and that a shining, electric-lit city with millions of strangers passing through would never notice one more person disappearing into them. Historians still debate how many people Holmes actually killed. They still debate how much of his own confession was truth and how much was theater for a newspaper paycheck. What isn't debated is that America's first documented serial killer built his entire operation 3 blocks from the most optimistic, forward-looking celebration of human progress the country had ever seen, and that almost nobody looked twice. If you want more deep dives like this one, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which case you want covered next.